You are listening to Demystifying Organizations. In partnership with McGraw-Hill Education, I'm your host, Jeff Shatton. Welcome back to a special episode of Demystifying Organizations. So most of my guests thus far have been experts in management-related fields, whether that's economics, organizational behavior, strategy, political science, sometimes even into philosophy, but always with some concentric circle that overlaps with management. Today's an exception, and I'm making this episode about criminal justice. Longtime listeners know that I've been teaching a class at a medium security prison, Augusta Correctional Center in Craigsville, Virginia, where I take 10 Washington and Lee students, and they take the class with 10 inmates at the prison. And one of the most remarkable human beings that I've ever met was an inmate there a few years ago. His name is Travis May, and I've gotten to know him over the past few years. And he's coming on the podcast to tell his story. Travis, I don't say this lightly, is one of the most inspiring people I've ever gotten to know. And I thought it was worthwhile to put it on this podcast because he has such a compelling story. And I have had the fortune to overlap with him a little bit over the past few years. The second half of the episode, I will feature Keramet Reiter. She's a professor of criminology, law, and society. And she's going to come on and discuss Travis May's story, as well as the broader issues that come up from Travis's story about criminology, prison reform, and the way that our criminal justice system operates. So I hope you enjoy, and I hope you get a lot out of this. Without further ado, Travis May. All right, I'd like to welcome to the podcast Travis May. Travis, thanks so much for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me, man. It's a great honor.
It's awesome to have you on the podcast. So let's just jump right in. You're going to tell us your story of how you came to where you are today. You want to give me just a little bit of background. How did you end up in prison to begin with?
I found myself a part of the street life, selling drugs and getting even more deeper into the street life aspect, talking about doing robberies and things of that nature. And you talk about it, you think about it, and next thing you know, you're doing it. And before long, I found myself sitting in the detective bureau in Virginia Beach, being charged with numerous armed robberies at 16 years old. And my mindset at the time was, if you do something, you just take the blame for it, and take the consequence that comes with it. So I was asking them, okay, yes, I did this. When do you think I'll get out of prison? And I distinctly remember one of the detectives telling me, he said, oh, you're going to get out of prison, but by the time that you do, I won't have any hair right here where you see hair. So I was like, well, how long is that going to be? So he was like, you might do 20 years, 15 years. So that blew my mind because I still didn't have a true understanding of time at that point in my life. And so, I went off to the juvenile detention center, and I stayed there for a week until they decided that they were going to certify me and treat me as an adult because of the severity of the offenses that I committed. And in Virginia, if the prosecution deemed fit, then they can appeal to court to treat the offender as an adult, even though they are a juvenile. So you're talking about 5 armed robberies. Was anybody hurt in those? Yeah, well, one individual got hurt, and one of the armed robberies, he was wounded in the shoulder. Well, my co-defendant had wounded him in the shoulder, and so we had 5 armed robberies and a malicious wound. And so my lawyer was. You were robbing banks, or? No, we were robbing fast food establishments. Okay. Like McDonald's and things of that nature. And the more that we would do it, the more your thinking started to venture out. You know, you started to become consumed by what you were doing and trying to figure out different ways or better ways of doing it, which is the criminal element just growing deeper and deeper within me. But once I got arrested and I'm now facing trial, my lawyer is informing me that I need to think about putting him in a position to fight the least amount of charges possible. The least amount of charges that he has to fight, the better off I am. So he wanted me to start pleading guilty to certain offenses and waiving other options in my trial or in the process of my trial. So I followed his lead. I waived a lot of hearings, and I ended up with a plea bargain. And the plea bargain was if I was to plead guilty to the offenses that I committed, that I would not receive any life sentences, and I would be sentenced in a term of years. So my lawyer argued for a sentence of 33 years because that's the least amount of time that I could get with the offenses that I committed. And he argued from the vantage point that I was young, I was still a child, so I had the greatest possibility of redeeming myself and going to prison, learning what I needed to learn, maybe get a trade, and come back out and be a productive member of society. The prosecution felt that a 75-year sentence would be more appropriate because even though I was a child, the offenses that I committed were serious, and they felt like the only way to rectify that was with a severe punishment in prison of 75 years. Now, what my lawyer made known to the court was that any sentence that I received on that day would be without parole, because even though Virginia had parole at that time, they also had a law that wasn't known too well, and that was called the three-strike law, and it was created for anybody that went in prison, came out, went back in prison, came back out, and went in again, then they would no longer have the benefit of going up for parole, no matter what kind of record they acquired in prison. So they amended that law several times throughout the years to finally read that if you get convicted of 3 or more robberies, 3 or more murders, or 3 or more rapes, any one of those crimes 3 or more times, even if you haven't been in prison one time, then you will fall under 3 strikes. So because I got convicted of 5 armed robberies, I fell under 3 strikes, even though I had never been in prison before. So with that being said, that's why my lawyer was arguing for the least amount of time. So my lawyer argued for 33, the prosecution argued for 75, and the judge took a recess, and he came back, and he sentenced me to 155 years.
Oh, my gosh. 155 years.
And his argument for that sentencing was, and I quote, he said, I agree with both attorneys today. I agree with the defense that Travis is young. He was very impressionable. But I also feel that Travis enjoyed being around guns or being around people with guns. So that bothers me. I also feel what the prosecution said, that each time Travis went into one of these establishments, there was the possibility of someone being hurt or losing their life. So that bothers me. And because of that, I sentenced as such. And then that's when he gave me 25 years for each robbery and continued to sentence me for all the other aspects that get put on the robbery charge. Because you commit a lot of different crimes or laws when you violate one, there's other attachments to it. So I left out of Virginia Beach Circuit Court with 155 years with no parole. And I went to Norfolk to stand trial for the robbery I had there. Because there were actually 4 armed robberies in Virginia Beach and 1 in the city of Norfolk. That's what total 5. So when I go to Norfolk for trial, I remember the judge saying, man, Virginia Beach gave you so much time, we don't even have to sentence you. But because you committed a crime in our city, we have to. So we're going to give you 7 years for the armed robbery and 3 years for the gun. And it's to be ran consecutive to the 155 years. So I left Norfolk with a total sentence between Norfolk and Virginia Beach of 165 years, and I was off to Virginia State Prison.
And how did you make sense of that at the age of 16? What was your headspace? How did you come to terms with it?
I never did. It was like the only thing that I remember in my mind being able to process was like, there's no way in the world I could be in prison the rest of my life for what I did. I know I'm supposed to be in prison because I violated some laws, but this is not making sense to me. So I have to die in prison, and I didn't kill anyone. And I was trying to make sense of it. So I suppressed it. It was too much to think about because it almost felt like I was being suffocated every time I thought about it. That I'm going to die in prison one day. I don't know when. If I live to be 80, then that's when I die. If I live to be 70 or 90 or whatever the case may be, and it was too much. And I knew that I didn't really know anything, and I had to put my mind in a state of numbness and aggression, because now I'm about to go into a place that I've only heard about and I don't know anything about, and I'm a child, I'm young, and I'm small. So now I'm trying to put myself in a mindset of total aggression. Like, okay, if I go in here, I'm going to make sure that if anybody try to mess with me, they're going to know that they got a fight on their hands. So that was my mindset going into Virginia prison system. And all around me, I was seeing other individuals filled with aggression. And we were just mirroring each other. And everybody was just filled with aggression. And, you know, you had those who were just going about their day, and you had those that were still trying to victimize people, you know. And I was trying to figure out how I could be better. But each time that I tried to become better, I was always reminded that it doesn't matter because you're going to die in here. It doesn't matter if you become better, you're going to die. So why go through the frustration of becoming better when it doesn't matter? So I found myself in segregation a lot because I was fighting. You know, I wasn't following the rules because it didn't matter if I followed the rules or not, because there was nothing waiting for a person that followed the rules except life in prison. So I still had a responsibility to the family members that were connected to me. So just out of that responsibility alone, that's what made me go and get my GED, get into trades, go to programs. And that was just so I could have some type of report when my family came to see me, or if I called them and they asked me, so what are you doing with your time? I just would placate them with, oh, well, I'm going to school to get my GED, or I'm in trade school, you know. So that's how I lived my first 7 years in prison, you know, just overwhelmed with the magnitude of the situation that I had to deal with. And, you know, I tried to ignore it with surrounding myself by individuals that were in my same situation, you know. And no matter what you did, at the end of the day, the reality was still the same. When you woke up in the morning, the reality was still the same. So no amount of distraction would allow for me not to deal with my situation. So at the 7-year mark, I received a letter from my attorney saying nothing else could be done in my case. He's sorry. He wishes me well. And if I ever need anything, just contact his office. And that blew my mind, because even though the situation was out of control, it was still a small part of me that hoped that somebody's going to see this and it's all going to be put straight. It's all going to be put straight, because there's people in here that have murdered multiple people and they're getting out before I get out. You know, I don't understand that, so it's going to be set straight somehow. But when I received that letter, that hope instantly got stripped away from me. It was like, oh, now I have somebody that knows about the law, that has been telling me year after year, just be patient, something's going to happen. And now he's telling me nothing's going to happen. Oh, no, yeah. I can't accept that. it was such a feeling of despair and hopelessness that the only thing that would allow me to get up out of my bed and function every day was the idea of escaping. I'm like, okay, that's a purpose. I have a purpose every day to get up and figure out how to break out of here. And that was the only thing that got me out of bed each day was, okay, man, you got to get up, you got to plan, you got to strategize. And I did that for a year after I received that letter. And at the end of that year, I picked the day that I was going to try to escape.
But what was your escape plan?
My escape plan, I made a ladder in my cell. I made a ladder in pieces. You know, I kept it in pieces so I would put it together the night that I was going to climb the fence with the ladder.
What was it made? What was it made out of?
It was made out of my steps were broomstick handles. I would take broomstick handles together to mop handles. And if you could picture that, you know the length of a mop.
Yep.
I would take the mop head off, and they were like security mops. So they had some sturdiness to them, but not enough sturdiness to where somebody can pick it up and bust somebody in the head with it. So everything in prison was like geared towards, okay, what's the least amount of damage somebody could do if they chose to use this as a weapon.
Mm-hmm.
So they were flexible, but if you wrapped them with tape, they became sturdy. So I would ask guys that work at certain shops in the prison to bring me back rolls of tape. So I take every broom handle and mop handle, and then I tape them all together and reinforce the steps with belts. You know, we had prison belts. So I reinforced the steps with belts. So on the night that I decided to escape, I put the ladder together, take it together, and the plan was, at the time, my definition of freedom was anything that existed on the other side of that fence that I've been looking at that felt like my whole life. So I really didn't have any true concept of freedom except if anything outside of this prison fence. And my mind started to take hold of, okay, either I'm going to get on the other side of that prison fence, even if it's for 1 minute, or I'm going to die in the process. And either way, I'm going to be free from this situation. So if they kill me, I'm not going to have to worry about it anymore. And if I make it, at least I touch freedom again. So those two thoughts were what were motivating me day in and day out. So when I made the ladder, I got out of the building.
How'd you get out of your room?
Well, we had access to be able to move in and out. In the building I was in, we was able to move in and out of our cells, but you couldn't move in and out of the building or in and out of floors. You could just stay on the floor that you were on. So I asked the officer to come down and open up my door for me to assist me. And when he came down there, I pushed him and locked him in the cell. So he was thinking that I was trying to hurt him because he couldn't make sense of what was going on. So I remember telling him, I'm not trying to hurt you, man. I just want to get out of prison, and I need to get you in this cell and use your keys to open up that door. So he's not hearing any of that because in his mind, I'm about to attack him and I'm just trying to do harm to him. So while he's screaming, I'm trying to tell him, man, no, I'm just trying to get out of prison. You just don't understand. And we both screaming. So now it's bringing people out in the hallway, and I finally get his keys from him, and I lock the door. I lock my cell door, and then I run with my ladder out of the building. I open up the front door to the building, and I run along the back of the building because I had to be mindful of the perimeter truck. Because it was a perimeter truck that always went around the prison all night and all day just making sure the perimeter was secure. Mm-hmm. So I hid behind the building until the perimeter truck made its round. Then I became indecisive. I was like, maybe I should let it make one more round. And then I was like, no, because I timed how long it takes for the perimeter check to take. So I decided to go ahead and make him run for it. So I put the ladder up on the building because I felt like if I climbed this building, then all I would have to scale was one fence. But in the space outside of that, you got to scale 3 fences with barbed wire. So my chances would increase just having to scale 1 fence. So I'm climbing on the ladder. I hear the door open up because it's like 2 o'clock in the morning. And when I look back, it's an officer who has came out of the building. He come out of the building and he's looking around and he doesn't see me yet. So I stay still. He take a few steps down the steps, and then he looks over and he sees me on the ladder and he screams, "Holy shit!" And he gets on his walkie-talkie, and next thing I know, his officers coming out of every building. So now I'm just doing a mad dash. I'm being cut by the barbed wire because I'm just trying to pull myself up on the building. So they climb up on the ladder and they grab me, and then we both fall. I fall into the barbed wire, and now they're trying to snatch me out of the barbed wire, but it's so frantic that one is pulling me one way, the other is pulling me another way, so it's just making me get more and more stuck in the barbed wire until finally they all pull me in the same direction. So they get me on the ground, they roughen me up, and now the only thing that I'm thinking is like, I didn't make it, and they didn't kill me. I could not believe that I'm now right back in the same situation, but in an even worse situation, because I didn't make it and I didn't get killed. So now I'm numb. They roughing me up, they beat me up. I'm just being carted off to segregation, and now they see that I'm doing a lot of bleeding, and they're like, "Oh my God, he's bleeding. What's going on? Go get the nurse." So when the nurse come over, she examines my wounds, and she like, "Look, he got to go to the hospital because he done lost so much blood he could go in shock." So they like, "He's not going anywhere. He's trying to escape. We're not taking him anywhere. He's gonna stay in the cell." So she go and make some call, and then when she comes back, they connect me to some electrical shock vest and pick me out to the hospital. So my wounds got a lot of dirt and mace and stuff in it, so they can't close my wounds up because they too dirty and they scared they would get infected. So I had to go through a therapeutic treatment, sit in the pool for a whole week. They would take me back and forth to the hospital. And all I remember that whole week, it was just, I was blank. I mean, I couldn't formulate any type of thought. It was just like a numb feeling, if you will. It was almost like I was scared to think anything. So it was like a meditative state, because I did meditate before that point. I learned how to meditate, and that would be another release that I would use in prison. And like working out and meditating was my 2 releases. They were short-lived releases, but they were releases all the same. So that's what I did my first week in segregation. I just meditated. And finally the thought came, and you got to tell your family what just happened, because they under the impression that you're okay, everything is fine, and then here you go, and you done committed more crimes in prison. Right. So I just knew that my family was going to disown me and say, "You haven't learned. Everything that you said over all these years meant nothing." So I remember I went to court for the charges of trying to escape, and I was sentenced to 55 more years in prison. And I just wanted to apologize to the officer, and I told him that I knew my words didn't mean much, but I was in such madness, and I apologized for making my madness a part of his reality, and nothing that I could say could change what I did, but that's what put him in that situation, was that I wasn't able to control my own madness, and I made him a victim of it. And they carted me off to a super maximum prison where I was to stay in segregation for all of the rest of my time.
So you were in like a medium security prison,
yeah.
And then they sent you to Supermax after you tried to escape. And they were going to put you in solitary confinement for the rest of your life.
Yes, because I was now deemed an escape risk and a security threat. So they didn't know if they would put me back in any type of population when I tried to escape again. So it was always a better and safer move to keep you isolated and then segregation. So that's what I was being told, that don't even think about ever coming out again because I'm a flight risk. So I had to make a decision right then. Okay, life just got worse. When I thought it couldn't get any worse than having 165 years in prison, now I have 220 years in prison, but now 220 years in segregation. So that thought, like, sobered me up. It sobered me up. Like, man, your family's coming to see you this weekend. You have to tell them what happened because they don't understand, like, why I'm all of a sudden on the super maximum prison. So when they come to the visitation room, they drive 8 hours to see me for a 1 hour visit behind the glass at a Supermax. And I remember telling my mother, look, don't come up here anymore. I'm sorry. This is why I did what I did. I was hopeless, and I'm sorry that I'm a continuous disappointment, and just don't waste your money or your resources coming up here anymore. And I remember my mother telling me, don't you ever disrespect me like that again. And I was like, what you talking about, Ma? And she was like, I don't care where you are on this earth. If I can make it there, I'm coming. So that's
really powerful.
Man, it changed my life because when I went back to my cell, I felt this great weight of responsibility. I'm like, I don't understand why these people still support me, still love me, and see a worth in me that I do not feel or experience. And I wanted to understand what it was that they seen. So I made a vow right then. I was like, okay, if I got to be in here the rest of my life, then I'm going to be in here as a man. And when they think about Travis, they're not going to get sad. They're not going to feel hopeless because right now that's what they were feeling anytime they thought about me, about my sad situation and how I'm adjusting or not adjusting. So now I want to be a beacon of strength where when they think about me and they going through whatever they're going through in the world, they can say, well, I can deal with this if he's dealing with that with his head held high. So I started to take responsibility for the position that I found myself in. I was no longer mad at the judge or felt victimized because I started to realize the same way I found myself in segregation because of my choices, I found myself in prison because of my choices. I might have been young, but I needed to take ownership of the space that I was in because I was never taking ownership of my space. I kept thinking that circumstances had a greater impact on what I would experience opposed to me thinking about defining what I'm experiencing. So I started to read, I started to meditate more, and then I started to become fearful because the individuals that were around me in long-term segregation started to lose their mind. You could see them starting to lose their mind, and that scared the hell out of me. Because I was like, man, I do not want to be back here crazy. I don't want to be back here, period, but I don't want to be back here crazy. And then I don't know what type of experience being crazy would be in prison, but I'm seeing it unfold all around me. So now I'm staying even more focused. I'm writing, I'm reading, I'm meditating, and at first it used to be hard to do, to understand how my thinking got me to where I was, how my anger and aggression would be my defense against anything small or big, and how I had the power to choose how I would respond to situations that frustrated me. Once I started to understand this, I tried to create ways that each day, my day would be purposeful. Like, okay, what can I apply now? What a principle can I apply? And I would use these principles in my encounters with officers.
Can you give me an example?
Okay, well, at Red Onion State Prison at one particular time, you had a lot of abuse. Officers would not feed you. They would come to your door with the food box, but it wouldn't be any tray in there, and they would say, "Oh yeah, well he's not hungry today." And if you had any type of assault on the officer or anything like that, you were a target in that type of environment. So it would be times when it was time for me to go out for my shower or my rec, and anytime you left the cell, you had to go in full restraint. You had handcuffs behind your back with a dog leash connected to it, shackles on your feet, 2 officers, each on one of your arms, whether you were going to the shower or to the cages for recreation. And it would be times when they would come, they were supposed to come to each cell and ask, "Do you want your hour rec today?" And they would have the mark on your truck whether you accepted or refused. So it would be times they would come to my door when it was shower time and not give me food, or it would be times they would come to my door and say, "You don't want rec today," and just walk off. So at first, the way I used to respond is that I'd be kicking the door, or I'd be screaming or snapping or plotting to, okay, first chance I get, I'm going to get him, But instead, I just recognize it as, okay, this is their way of processing their resentment or judgment of me. It has nothing to do with me. I don't have to feel like they took something from me. I can go about the regular process to grieve it. And I started to rationalize and process more, and I still was dealing with the anger of what they were doing, but I would not allow the anger to dictate a reaction. I would just focus it on, okay, well, I'm going to just write agreements, or I'm going to write this up, or when they make their rounds, I'm going to ask them, like what is motivating you to not give me what I'm supposed to have back here in segregation, and try to engage them in some type of conversation and not give them the normal reaction that they get when they do that type of stuff to people. And so the more that I did that, the more it became easier to do. And the more it became easier to do, the less that they would do it to me, the less they would target me. So now they're starting to have conversations with me like, "What are you doing back here? Like, what would make you do what you did?" And then at the time I didn't have hope, and it doesn't justify anything, but I did not have any hope outside except dying to get any relief or touching the other side of the fence. And then I would get responses like, "Man, I don't blame you. I would have done the same thing." And, so year after year of being back there and they getting used to me being back there, it became a different type of encounter. They would ask me if I wanted extra food. And at one point, they used to take my food. They would ask me if I wanted extra rec time, but accepting any of that would now make you a target of the individuals you back there with. So it was a real catch-22 and balancing act. But after 5 years of segregation, I remember they came to me and they was like, "Look, we're going to take a chance on you and put you in modified segregation," which is the same type of segregation but without the isolation. You get a cell partner, but y'all both still in segregation, but you got a cell partner. So I was excited, to have that human contact encounters, to be able to talk to another human being.
Wait, so that was the first person you talked to in 5 years, like face to face?
Yes, outside of the officers that would come around.
Yeah.
Or the people that's back there, you can hear them in the cell next to you or downstairs. You could talk to them, but you couldn't see them. Not unless they were getting transported out of their cell. But so I was excited. I used to get on my cell partner nerves because he used to be like, "Man, why are you so damn happy?" And I'm like, "Man, you just don't understand. I was just in hell and was supposed to stay in hell. I was in segregation. I've been in segregation 5 years." And then he'll start to understand. But I started to appreciate the smaller things in life. I really had to break it all the way down to the most simplistic things. And in doing so, I started to have a spirit of gratitude. I didn't feel like I was lacking anything. Yes, did I still want to be free? Absolutely. But I did not allow my condition to dictate how I felt. And the more that I started to embrace that thinking, the more my life became purposeful to me. it was like, man, I deserve, even if it's in this small little cell, to breathe and live and to find happiness in any way that I can find happiness. And the thing that brought me the most happiness was being a motivation to my family. Anytime that I could get on the phone, anytime that I could see them, and the only way that I could be a true motivation was to understand all the impediments in my career to the best that I could, figure out a way to expose them, bring them up, and do away with them and replace them with principles that I read about, principles that used to just be ideas. And the more that I would do that, it was like the more I could see clearly. And then I'm starting to see my environment, and I'm seeing that it's individuals that's with me in my environment, but they have a chance that I don't have. They can go home. So now I'm trying to understand why they're not in a different mindset. Why are they frustrated? Like, you have an opportunity that I wish I could have, but you're not concentrating on that opportunity. You're concentrating on what's going on in here. That's backwards to me. You know, so I would have those discussions and try to ignite the passion that I think I would have if I had an opportunity to get back out there. So I started to operate like that. I would go to the programs, same programs I did when I was young, but I had buy-in this time. I wanted to understand if these programs can help me see my situation better and live a better life, then I'm going to give myself to them. But if they don't, then I'm going to just discard them. So I started going to the programs, asking questions, trying to...
What kind of programs? What kind of programs?
The main program I remember is two. It was problem solving, and it was thinking for a change. Thinking for a change was the greatest program that I encountered when I was in prison, because it taught you how to become aware of your risky thinking, your riskful feelings, and your attitudes and beliefs, the things that you operated from, the principles that you operated from in general life, and when pressure was down on you, like what you would lean on. So I understood this to a small degree with the reading and things that I was doing and the different philosophies that I was just trying to read and become aware of, but I didn't understand how to break it down in relation to myself with my own attitudes and beliefs. And thinking for a change assisted me in being able to do that more effectively. So the more that I did that, the more I could understand my own mental and physical reactions to things, and to use those things as cues to get control of my thinking. You know, I never knew that I had a physical reaction that was unique to me whenever I started to feel stressed. I didn't know that. So once I pinpointed that, that allowed me more thinking time in the moment. And mine, for an example, was I sweat on my nose when my stress levels start to rise. I just accepted that as just something that happens when it's about to go down. It's about to go down. I'm sweating on my nose. So now I'm starting to take that information and use it to create more thinking time in the moment. And the more that I create more thinking time in the moment, the more freedom I'm starting to feel. I'm like, okay, I've always felt suffocated and controlled by my environment and by situations. Now I'm able to see beyond those situations and beyond my environment. So now I'm walking around with a different type of spirit. It's like I got a different mentality, and guys wondering, like, man, ain't that to do with all that time? Why is he walking around like that? And in a sincere way.
They think you're crazy. Yeah, they think you're crazy.
Yeah, and it's like, okay, he's in denial. And I even thought I was in denial at one point. I was trying to figure out, okay, am I just Chris Angeling myself or mind freaking myself right now? Or am I truly in a happy place within myself and within my life? And when I asked that question, I realized that regardless of where you may be at in your life or what your circumstances may be, you are still in life. You still have a life to live and a space to inhabit. And you got a choice. You can live it to the best of whatever your ability is, or you can allow it to define your life, which it really doesn't have the power to do now unless you give it. So the more that I started to understand that no matter what my space may look like, I'm still in life, and I still have the right to be happy, to be peaceful, to still have a vision and goals and try to accomplish them, even though these goals and visions may be different than people's goals and visions in the world, so to speak. You know, my vision and goal had to be, okay, I want to make as many people smile and be uncomfortable today when they try to complain to me. I wanted to make them uncomfortable and they complain. You know, so that would be my goal for today.
Yeah.
Because in that environment, people complain all the time. You know, it is a norm and there's an energy that if you're not aware, you'll find yourself just doing all the time because that's how you relate. Let's relate our complaints. You know, that's how people bonded. You know, that was the commonality. So I would go against that and be like, you know, so why are you complaining about that? And they look at me like I'm crazy. What you mean? We didn't get our wreck today. We were supposed to get our wreck. I'm not just going to lay down. I'm saying, well, okay, how did you handle that? Like, you didn't get wrecked and you frustrated, so you compounding the problem. So I would just do that. And in doing that, it made me have to be more responsible for my own frustrations and actions when I didn't want to take that thinking up. So, you know, it made you become scrutinized more, you know, because guys like, okay, you talk that talk. Now, when a situation arises, we want to see how you're going to handle it. So that actually helped me to be more present. So as I continue to move and live like that, I found myself being pulled by the administration to help with the programs because guys were giving me a respect that was misguided as I don't know what. Because nobody really tried to escape, guys see me as some type of like, oh, man, that's a legend or something like that. I knew the truth. And the truth was I gave up. I was overwhelmed. I was hopeless. And I was feeling a degree of despair that I had never known until that moment. And I gave up. And that to me wasn't something that was to be honored and respected. You know, I respected that man who might have been in my same situation, but day for day, he was doing what he needed to do to take account of the consequence that his actions has brought to him. That was strength to me. You know, and he wasn't crying or whining about his plight. He realized that he made some choices that put him in that situation, and he's wearing it and walking in it with responsibility. So I started to expose myself when the young guys used to be like, oh, man, how you doing, man? Look, what happened? Man, it's nothing that was cool about what I did. It was straight cowardly what I did. Now, had I had a different mindset, then maybe so. But I'm not going to allow you to project on me a mindset that I didn't have. I had a hopeless and weak and desperate mindset when I did what I did. You know, so I don't feel proper with accepting any type of respect like I did something heroic, you know. So that would confuse people, but it will open up dialogue about, you know, what is freedom? Like, what is, you know, your responsibility to your freedom, you know, and things of that nature. And so that made me start to get into more programs and classes because I wanted to understand how the DOC programs truly translated in the life of a prisoner, you know, and with everything that you deal with as a life as a prisoner. And the more I was able to bridge that gap, the more I was becoming effective at explaining it and helping others use those same tools, you know. And what I started to learn is that they would take it from somebody that they feel is just like them before they take it for somebody that might have had the intelligence not to put themselves in the position that we were in, you know. So I started to help the administration administer the programs. And the more that I did that, the more that they would like, okay, put me in charge of the programs or the teaching. Not all the programs, but it would be classes where they would let me lead the class because the guys were receptive to what was coming out of my mouth, even though what was coming out of my mouth was the same as what was coming out of the counselor's mouth. Mm-hmm. But they would take it from me because they identified with me. So I continued to move on year after year like that, and I was finding my purpose and helping others regain or connect to a power that they never had, which was themselves. You know, that no matter what situation you're in is a way to regain your own worth and your own power. But you have to be brave enough to do so. So the more that I was doing that, the more I started to feel as if I deserve more than this. You know, I deserve more than this. Not an entitlement, like an egotistical entitlement, but I deserve to think bigger than what I'm thinking. You know, and the first opportunity I had with that reality or that chance to have that was when they posted up on our bulletin board that Washington and Lee would be offering classes at the prison. Mm-hmm. So that was just like unbelievable. Absolutely not. They can't be doing this. And then I remember looking at the bulletin and saying, man, there's no way in the world they're going to let me in that class. I got all this time. I got the type of history that I have. They're not going to want me around the students. You know, so I discounted myself. And I almost didn't even apply. And because I knew from my situation that I couldn't even get in regular classes, not unless I was helping with the class, because my Senate, they didn't want to waste resources on somebody that they deemed were never getting out. Right. So I knew that this particular opportunity, they wouldn't want to waste that unique and valuable resource on me. But to my surprise, I was accepted in the class, and it was another pivotal point in my life. It changed my whole life. It opened my mind up in a way that I did not know it needed to be open. It made me so thirsty for more. You know, it awakened me. It put me back in touch with a degree of my humanity that was lost, that I couldn't and didn't know how to restore, no matter how much I moved and operated around with different principles and things of that nature. It put me back in touch with my humanity.
How's that? What is it about the college classes?
Because we were in a class with actual students who were in a class, actual professors, and we were all learning together. And it wasn't a feeling. They did a great job with making us all feel equal. And to give somebody that's in that environment, like a prisoner, the space to feel equal when you take on everything that your situation or your environment tells you should have taken on, that you're being punished, you are less than, you don't know how to think, because if you did, you wouldn't be where you are. You know, all of these different attributes prisoners take on to themselves. And now you're sitting in a class of one of the top schools in America, and you're being treated as an equal. To most of us, that's the first time we ever been treated as an equal, whoever got to participate. You know, so it was almost like coming into a whole nother life, you know, something that you could only dream about, because some of us never even finished high school, let alone think about going to college, you know, so.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing teaching the prison class, right? Because for me, I don't have a corrections background. Like, it would never even occur to me to treat the inmates any different than the Washington Lee students.
And that was experience. Like, because you really wasn't trying not to do that it was just natural to you to do that, it came across as natural, and that's what made the experience natural. That's why it wasn't hard for individuals to accept that, because many individuals that went into those classes went in insecure and already somewhat defensive. Happy to have the opportunity, but not want to made to be looked like a fool or to be looked down upon or to be like some circus act. So you've done a great job at not even allowing that fear to find anywhere to manifest a plan. You know, and the students done it did the same type of job, you know, and it created a safe environment. And many of us had never experienced a safe environment up until that point.
So how did things go from there? So you took 2 classes with Washington Lee, right? One with me and one with
Professor Brockman.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then what happened from there?
Man, listen, I get chills just thinking about that experience. After my first class with Professor Brockman, you know, I don't know what I turned into, but I was not prisoner Travis May, state number 1020330. I was a free man. Just my circumstances hadn't caught up with my situation yet. You know, my circumstances had not caught up with my thinking. That's all I knew. I was like, okay, I am totally free. Right now, other people don't know it yet, but soon my circumstances will catch up with my thinking, and I let it go, and I continued to move on. Then your class came. So, you know, I'm thinking, man, it would be awesome to be able to get back into another one of these classes, but if not, I'm still grateful for my experience that I'm still eating off of. And I was blessed to get in your class. Once I got into your class, here we go, a whole nother level of opening up and experiencing life and myself in another way. You know, I had not seen myself in a way that your students were able to articulate that they seen me. And that created such a great sense of pride and worth within me that I thought was already established in me from my own work. You know, but to hear it come from people who were totally objective. They didn't have any buy-in outside of, okay, I hope that you are able to hold your weight when we do our final project. You know? So to know that what they were saying was their sincere perspective and it was objective in the sense of them not having any true buy-in, it created a space of responsibility. Like I felt responsible for what they seen in me. And the same way that I felt responsible for what my family started to see in me. And that made it easier to continue to live by it and figure out ways to reinforce it. So
yeah, the adoration of the W&L students for you in particular was remarkable.
And it was felt in a remarkable way.
Yeah.
I mean, I had never got so emotional reading some of the things that they had said about me, that you were saying about me. I mean, I turned into a mess. I was like, what is going on? That it broke me. I don't know what's going on, but seriously, man, it was an experience that sprouted life in me time and time again. And so from that point on, I had put in a petition for a commuted sentence, you know, to the governor. And that's something that I had never heard happen all my time in prison. And it was something that was so rare that it was unbelievable. But I remember telling my family and my attorney, I was like, man, I just feel so free. I feel so free and worthy that I think we should amend that and get a request for a pardon added to it. And so I remember my lawyer saying, man, you will be lucky if the people even look at your case because you tried to escape, Travis. You have to keep that in mind. Now, I'm not trying to bring your spirits down, but you want to keep this thing into perspective because you don't want to find yourself in the same situation of hopelessness that you did when you tried to escape before. So just keep this stuff into perspective. And I remember I used to tell my attorney, man, I'm special. And go ahead and get your champagne. And he would get frustrated with me. He was like, please stop calling my office with that stuff because you're frustrating me, man. I'm scared that you will lose hope. And I said, man, the only difference between me now and me then is that I had no foundation. I was not standing on any foundation except fear, frustration, and aggression. I said, now I have a foundation of love, a foundation of purpose, a foundation of freedom. So even if this doesn't manifest how we want it to, it doesn't stop me operating in those realities that I have a purpose, that I am free. And so I can think and hope as big as my mind will allow, and I'm not scared to fall because there's no falling. There's only flying from this point. So he'll be like, oh my God, okay, all right. And then it would get to the point where I would call his office, hey, man, how you doing, man? I just want to see what kind of day you're having, And is it a beautiful day? He was like, man, I'm busy. Why are you calling me? And I was like, man, you are a very passionate but angry and pessimistic man. And I want to pour some positivity and some optimism into you. And he was like, Travis, just please stop calling my office. So, and for real. So, and he would tell you to this day, that I used to give him a headache every time his secretary would tell him, is Mr. May calling? So, to somewhat bring the story in, I'll go about my day-to-day life in the prison, helping with the programs, doing what I do, and making connections to people and seeing people who have never been seen or connected to before. And that's where my purpose is pulling me. So one day I come in the pod, I just got off a long day of work, doing the programs, and a guy was supposed to come to my pod to give me his name and information so I could pass it on to some people that wanted to help individuals that was in his situation. Now, I told him to come to the party at 5 o'clock because they locked down at 5:45, and I wanted to be able to get my shower and eat. So he does not show up at 5 o'clock, and he shows up when they announce lockdown. Now, I'm not into getting in trouble anymore or anything like that. I abide by all rules, not because I'm scared to get in trouble, but because that's just what I do now. So when they call lockdown, I hear him calling my name at the door, and I'm like, man, it's too late. He was like, no, I'm sorry, man, I had to take care of something, and I'm frustrated. And I'm like, man, y'all just don't value y'all freedom. I just don't understand how people who have an opportunity to be free do not value it. That just don't make sense to me. So he's like, all right, man, okay. So I'm like, man, let me jump on the kiosk. But if this officer in the booth say, get off the kiosk before I'm finished, that's it. So he was like, all right, just do what you can do. So I jump on the kiosk, and I remember opening up my page for my emails. And I see I had a piece of mail. So I open up, I click on mail, and it says, is your name Travis Hassan May? If so, the governor pardoned you today. Please call me ASAP. I'm a reporter. And, man, wow. I could not compute, and this is not a joke. I'm not saying this to try to get a laugh. My brain lost all intelligence. I did not know what pardon meant. It was like, what do you mean? I got a pardon. What is a pardon? What do they do with people with pardon? So then I snap out of it, and the guy like, yo, what you doing? And I'm like, hold up, I got to call this number. And I called the number, and the reporter, he on the other end, and he's like, Travis, congratulations. I'm like, congratulations for what? So he's like, man, you haven't heard? I'm like, heard what? And now I can feel my breath come. I'm like, what you talking about? And he said, man, I can't believe that they had a press conference and nobody told you. So I was like, told me what? And he was like, man, the governor gave you a pardon today. And he was like, let me read what he said. And when he read that the governor said that he was proud to be able to give me an opportunity that I was denied many years ago, and the fact that I was doing what I was doing within the prison walls without any hope of getting out, that no matter what I did, it was not going to change my reality. He felt proud to be able to give me that second chance that I deserved. And all I remember is just crying like it was a soul cry. I mean, I wasn't crying like a baby. It was a soul cry because all I wanted to do was call my family and say, it is over. Even now, I get emotional.
Yeah.
Yeah, so.
I mean, I remember it was one of the happiest things that I feel like has happened in my life was seeing that you got pardoned. It was very emotional for me, and yeah, I can only imagine.
I remember you saying, brother, the last day that we was in the class, you was like, Travis, I look forward to having to be with you one day.
Yeah.
And I was like, man, I only hope, absolutely, we're going to do that. You know, and talk like that used to be very painful to engage in.
Yeah.
You know, so I wouldn't engage in it. But, man, and, you know, I prepared myself for that moment. And when that moment came, it was overwhelming and disbelieving. But I quickly just wanted to run around the prison and tell guys, I told y'all, if you a student, apply yourself. Don't allow your circumstances to dictate how you feel. Be responsible for where you at and utilize where you at in a way to make your life count. There's no limit to what can happen in your life. And that's all I wanted to do. Was tell them I won't crazy. And now dudes coming to man. Now dudes that would used to smile in my face every day, now they telling me the truth. Man, I thought you was crazy, man. The way you used to walk around here, we used to say, man, that man crazy. He don't know that he gonna be in prison the rest of his life, but he walking around here like he's free. Look at him. So it was amazing, man. And then to get home and to finally walk and breathe freely, it's still unbelievable. It is unbelievable, man. And I'm motivated by now going back into the prisons. And at first, it was I had a mission in my own mind. I wasn't sharing it with anybody. Every day that I was incarcerated, I always thought, what could someone have said to me that would have changed my thinking to not make the decisions that I made? My family had always told me once I started to go out into the streets more, you're going to end up dead or in jail. You're going to end up dead or in jail. And when you hear that so much, you become numb to it. And then you start to think when you're young that, yeah, that might be other people, but that ain't me. And if it is me, I can deal with it. But you don't know the magnitude of a thing until you're in it. Like those young people that got killed being out there in the street did not know the magnitude of not having life go on again. Right. The individuals that's young that end up in prison do not know the magnitude of being in that reality. So every day I wanted to figure out what could someone have said to me. And then I realized that it was the fact that I had disappeared. My actions had become bigger than the person. They were focused in on my actions more than they were focused in on the child. And
what do you mean? What do you mean by that?
Well, they, like my actions, they became fearful that my actions were going to lead me to prison or end up dying. So that was where their attention went to the most.
Yeah.
Instead of speaking to the child started to disappear. You know, the person, my personality, all of those things started to disappear, and my actions became bigger than me. So instead of, they did not know how to continue to pour love and understanding and guidance into me because my actions was creating a fear that I'm sacrificing my future, and they could see that, but did not know how to connect to me, the person, the child. You know?
So what are you doing today to in working with at-risk youth?
Well, what I do now, I mentor a few at-risk youth. You know, I went back to pay homage to the lawyer that represented me. You know, to tell him
Did you have champagne with him?
You said what?
Did you have any champagne with him?
No, I didn't. Yeah. Oh, you said champagne.
Champagne, because you kept saying.
Yeah. I thought you said campaign. Hey, no, yes. I finally took him his champagne, and he was like, about time you got this, because it took me almost a year to get him the champagne. I had to save my pennies. So when I brought him the champagne, he was like, man, you were a headache. You were a true headache, man. But I am so glad that I got to meet you and that I was able to represent you and help you. And I just hope that you take this chance and never look back. And I'm like, man, I promise you, the only looking back I'm going to do is to be able to give back. But I went to my attorney that I had when I was a juvenile. And I wanted to thank him for what he had said, because he had said some things in the courtroom to the judge, asking the judge not to sentence away my life. He was telling the judge that I was young, I had family support, and I needed to learn some lessons, but don't give up on me. And I remember when I got all of that time, he had came back to the bullpen. That's where they hold you when you're waiting or finish with court. And he had said, Travis, please do not give up hope, because if something were to change in your situation, you don't want to have given up hope and then got more time, more situations. That for so long, his voice was in my head when I was ready to give up. And then finally, it didn't matter any longer, because my hopelessness had gave way to everything. But I wanted to tell him the impact that his words had on me for the years that they had an impact on me, And when I did so, I had met his secretary and I had met his wife, and they asked me could I help them with 2 juveniles that they were representing. And then that just started to open up the door. I started to go to Boys and Girls Clubs, and I didn't want to scare the kids, because that's what people use as a tool to try to get kids to correct their behavior, is to scare them, and oftentimes that does not work. It might work for a time, but it's not a tool that can truly guide a child. So I just wanted to tell the children at the Boys and Girls Club that I see you, you're worth it. Do not allow any situation to overshadow your worth. If you ever need help or a voice or somebody to talk to, here go my contact information. I want to talk to your parents, because I wanted the parents to know the value of continuing to stay connected to the spirit of the child and not allow the behavior to become bigger than the child. Because that's the only way that the child will continue to digest the guidance of the parent when they still feel connected to the parent or whoever the guardian might be. So that is what I've been doing. I've been speaking to a lot of different juvenile groups or children that might have never even thought about committing a crime and are doing good. I'm just trying to be a motivation and a guidance and a reflection of what could happen when you take your eye off the ball. So
it's an incredible story of the human spirit.
Wow.
And I feel personally really honored to have played some role in it.
Without question, brother. And believe you played a big role in it, because you always made me responsible from day one that I came to your class to today. You have always made me responsible for the man and the power that I possess. You have always spoke to that, and you never slackened in that because of the fact that I might have been in prison as a child or anything like that. You always expected the best, So that's a beautiful blessing to have you in my life. I feel proud to say I have you in my life.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. But your story is something else, and definitely thank you so much for coming on the podcast. You're not my traditional guest, but I think it's the most compelling and amazing story of the human spirit, and something that has certainly left an indelible mark on my life. So thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Absolutely, thank you for having me. I hope I left some tape. On the road. I got a little long with it, but I appreciate it, man.
That's how you are.
right, brother.
All right, Jarvis.
Have
I'll talk to you
yourself a beautiful day. Yes, sir.
All right, bye.
My next guest is Keramet Reiter. Keramet studies prisons, prisoners' rights, and the impact of prison and punishment policy on individuals, communities, and legal systems. She uses a variety of methods in her work, including interviewing, archival and legal analysis, and quantitative data analysis, in order to understand both the history and impact of criminal justice policies, from medical experimentation on prisoners and record-clearing programs to gun control laws and the use of long-term solitary confinement in the United States and internationally. Keramet is an associate professor of criminology, law, and society at University of California, Irvine School of Social Ecology. I'd like to welcome to the podcast Keramet Reiter. Keramet, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So we've listened to the amazing, compelling story of Travis, and I just want to start by getting your initial response from his story.
Basically, what you said, it was a beautiful, inspiring story, and I'll say two things. On the one hand, as you and I were saying when we were chatting, he's obviously an inspirational, unusual person when we think about the millions of people who are incarcerated or experience incarceration every year in the U.S. Not many of them end up in Travis's situation, right? You were saying
Right.
He was one of 6 out of thousands to get a pardon from the governor. And on the other hand, so I was struck by that, this really charismatic person who was telling such an inspiring story. And on the other hand, I was struck by how many of his experiences are so common in prison, right? And that there are so many Travises out there dealing with the same challenges and kind of holding those two things simultaneously. And that, on the one hand, Travis's story makes us think about the incredible power of the individual to overcome. And on the other hand, I wouldn't want us to think that we should expect that of everybody in prison, right? They need Travises like them to support them and help them, so that's those two things kind of I experienced simultaneously, went back and forth between thinking about his story.
Yeah, I mean, for me, his moving from what seems like the depths of hell,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, that the knowledge that you have a life sentence
Mm-hmm.
and then you try and die or
Mm-hmm.
escape. So
Mm-hmm.
he tries to escape with the intention of either being killed or escaping in the process,
Mm-hmm.
to end up then in a supermax prison for 5 years of solitary confinement, right? It's hard to think of anything in the human condition, in the human experience, that would be so low. And then to crawl his way out
Mm-hmm.
through sheer will and force of change, to me, is
Mm-hmm.
truly remarkable. And the only analogy that his story draws to for me is Elie Wiesel in Night,
Mm-hmm.
where it just reminds me, very different circumstances,
Mm-hmm.
but of somebody who just is a testament to the human condition and the human spirit, to go from, as hard as you can possibly have life in a concentration camp, to go from that to becoming this world-renowned figure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the parallels between what people experience in our most extreme prisons and what people experience in war are striking and disturbing, right? I've interviewed hundreds of people who've spent time in solitary confinement, and one of the things you often find is that they have symptoms that really resemble post-traumatic stress disorder the same way a veteran or a prisoner of war might. And so, we're talking about overcoming that on top of everything else.
So what are the universal experiences that Travis went through that struck you?
So, first, being sentenced to an incredibly long life sentence, often with no hope as a teenager, is is horrifyingly common in the United States. In the early 2000s, people started to do research around this, around the time the U.S. Supreme Court said kids shouldn't be executed. So people who were under 18 at the time of their crime shouldn't be eligible for the death penalty. People started then to look into life and life without parole sentences doled out to kids, to kind of hoping to extend the logic prohibiting death sentences. And it turns out that whereas in the rest of the world, there's a few dozen people who experience those kinds of sentences, there are thousands of kids in the US. And that's, the initial research was on life without parole. And Travis's sentence was a sentence of years, but more than 100 years, right? Is that
right? 160 years was.
Yeah. So that's, even though now the Supreme Court has put really strict limitations on when juveniles can be sentenced to life without parole, there's a lot of legal ambiguity about whether that includes really long life sentences like Travis had that don't literally say life without the possibility of parole.
So what are the ranges of punishments that someone might expect for committing 5 armed robberies?
Anything from a few years to hundreds of years in the United States.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. When I've done a lot of work in Scandinavian prisons also, and one of the things Scandinavians always say is it true that in the United States they sentence people to more than 100 years? Isn't that absurd? Like people
Right.
don't live that long. It's just it's purely symbolic, and that doesn't make sense. Punishment should be more instrumental and rehabilitative.
But I want to just drill down a little bit on these variation of years, right?
Mm-hmm,
Because one of the things that we would want in a just society is some idea, right, of if I do X,
mm-hmm.
I can expect Y,
Mm-hmm.
right? And of course, things don't have to be perfect, but we would expect that there be some normal distribution
Okay.
between if I commit 5 armed robberies in California versus 5 armed robberies in Virginia, or even
Right.
for that matter, if I commit 5 armed robberies and I'm black in Virginia versus if I commit 5 armed robberies and I'm white in Virginia,
Right.
or if I get this judge or that judge. We would want some kind of normalcy of I can expect between 5 and 7 years versus I can expect between 3 years and 100 years.
Right. And we want that normalcy for both instrumental and pure justice reasons, right? Like we have a sense that there should be equity. That's the justice reason. And then we also, one of the driving theories of why we would punish it all, and certainly punish this harshly, is to discourage people from doing this behavior again. That's deterrence. And it requires, deterrence is usually theorized as something that must be certain. and you're talking about an uncertainty that fundamentally undermines the kind of instrumental justification for doing this.
So what, in your mind, what would teenage sentencing look like for a Travis in an ideal world in the United States?
I am very much supportive of the movement that has limited long and harsh sentences for children on the, for a number of reasons. One, that we understand neurologically with hard science that their brains aren't fully developed and they don't make decisions as well as people who are older. And then behaviorally, we understand that people tend to age out of crime. The vast majority of people age out in their 20s, and then the crime continues to drop as people get older and older. Not to say that older people never commit crimes, but it's just it's much more rare. And so, from both those perspectives, it's giving someone like Travis, no matter what they've done, a really long sentence is really socially expensive and not necessarily likely to be that effective. And I think one of the most poignant ways to think about this actually is that people in their 16, 17 committing these kinds of crimes, one of the challenges is that they're not really able to think that far into the future. And so Travis is not really understanding what his sentence meant until almost 10 years later, when he realized that there really was no hope for him is very representative of part of the problem with sentencing someone his age to this long a sentence, is that they can't even imagine what that means, and they don't even internalize it for years. And so it's not serving any kind of purpose, right? They literally don't, their brain isn't developed enough to process that kind of punishment.
So would you still have sentencing for a 16-year-old, let's say, that commits armed robbery? What would you do?
I generally think that our prison system is much too focused on warehousing and harming people, or making them experience a harsh punishment, right? Like taking away as many sort of comforts as possible. And I think that doesn't work very well for many people. And I think it's especially terrible for teenagers. So, I would say education is generally a great alternative. So putting someone like that in some kind of really comprehensive education environment, certainly maybe in a closed institution, right? And making sure that there's behavioral treatment. So some kind of therapy for whatever's going on, whether it's emotional trauma that person has experienced, or addiction issues, or behavior issues that just haven't been addressed. And those kinds of, what's shocking is that we know that those kinds of investments in treatment and education have incredible social payoffs, right? Often actually hiring a teacher or hiring a therapist is less than the cost of putting someone in a secure confinement facility, especially a supermax like Red Onion State Prison, where Travis ended up, that's incredibly costly to run. So it's actually cheaper to provide kind of more intensive care, and the outcomes are just infinitely better, right? People who get educations or get good treatment tend to not recidivate and to be less dangerous. And then actually earn incomes and pay taxes.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, when I think of myself as a 16 or 17-year-old, or my friends that I had when I was 16 or 17, it just feels like we're a complete accident of birth at that age. And that, I mean, I would hesitate at all to take my 16 or 17-year-old self and give any benefit to what I did that was right, or condemn pretty much anything I did that was problematic. That I would be horrified, right? And I was within normal limits of a 16 or 17-year-old, but I was a 16, 17-year-old guy, and it's hard to imagine myself now at 37, even remotely resembling that person. Yeah. And I think that's for most of us, right? Yeah. Where we deserve some distance from, especially when you're a minor, of any actions that you did, because eventually you become a 40 or 50-year-old, and it's just not the same person.
Right. And not to minimize Travis's actions or the actions of other kids who break the law, but imagine, I mean, we've all broken the law in some small way, right? And imagine if the 3 or 4 times you did that defined the entire rest of your life. It's
so that's where I think sentencing is so important, right? Because obviously 160-year sentence to something that somebody does at 16, and especially when nobody was killed, is utter insanity. Right. I do think that there is a point that a 16-year-old can wrap their head around a prison sentence. I am not a criminologist. I don't know what that number is, but 5 years or something like that is something that does not feel like a life sentence. And like you said, could be much more rehabilitative oriented. Some kind of, I don't know what the number is. Maybe it's 10 years, maybe it's 5, maybe it's 3. It's not for me to decide. It's certainly not 160 years.
Right. I think the power, one piece of Travis's story that's so important is just the power of hope. And part of why I think he was able to survive was that he had, at some point, he shifted his perspective and he had hope, even though there was no good reason for that.
In spite of everything that would give you every reason not to have hope.
Exactly. And that's part of what's so inspiring about this story. But it's also, I think it's a really important lesson for us as listeners and us as citizens and policymakers, is that hope was so fundamental to the change he was able to make, both for his colleagues in prison and in himself and his ultimate ability to get out. And when we give someone a 160-year sentence, we are eliminating all possibility of that for the vast majority of people. And we know that also has a real power to really discipline people, right? To encourage them to become functioning members of society again, and to take that away seems irrational.
So one of the things that comes up in his case is the 3 strikes and you're out rule. Mm-hmm. And this was news to me. I had always assumed that 3 strikes and you're out meant that you commit a felony, you go to prison, you get out. You commit a felony, you go to prison, you get out. You commit another felony, now you're on your 3 strikes and you're out. What I didn't know was that all 3 strikes could have happened at one time, because he commits 5 different armed robberies. Yeah. Can you comment a little bit about, I guess, his unique case of 3 strikes and you're out, and I guess more broadly, probably 3 strikes and you're out as I know it, and I assume most other people know or understand it the way that I do?
I think maybe I'll step back and talk about it in terms of, you started this by thinking about what's a fair and productive sentence, right? And there's all these inequities, like the fact that Travis was treated differently in Virginia than California, and maybe based on the color of his skin. And I think it's fundamental to understand that programs like 3 strikes partly grew out of an intention to be more consistent, right? That we do have this visceral sense that that's crazy, that you might spend 5 years in one state for the same thing you might spend 160 years in prison for in another state. And 3 strikes is trying to be really consistent about that. And part of what's so important about understanding these kinds of attempts at making sentencing fixed or determinate and consistent is that it's really hard in a system as big as ours to take away the discretion completely. And so there's so much wiggle room within any of these laws about how people's actions are characterized and charged, and ultimately the kinds of convictions they receive. And so, I'm not surprised at all by Travis's story, because I know that the way part of what happened in determinate sentencing is that prosecutors had a lot of power based on how they characterized the initial action in the kinds of sentences people were ultimately eligible for. And so, prosecutors can charge multiple strikes at once. Prosecutors can also make the choice about whether something is a felony or not, right? Depending on how they describe the crime. And so that's been a big problem in California, is that lots of times, depending on the prosecutor, you have something that someone might consider a misdemeanor, another prosecutor charges as a felony. And that has, lifetime consequences.
So what can prosecutors do? I assume good intent by most prosecutors. I don't think that, the majority of them, they're not out there to have an unjust system. So what can prosecutors do, or what can we do, I guess, from a public policy standpoint, given, that we live in a country with a federal system and then unique state laws, to make that more equitable?
So my starting place is often that our system is just completely oversized, right? And someone like Travis, who is serving 160 years for something he did at 16 or 17, is a perfect example of that, right? We put too many people in prison for too long. And I often say this about solitary confinement also. We put too many people in solitary confinement for too long. And so the first step is just thinking about drastically reducing that population. And so, for a prosecutor, that means charging fewer people. Now, that's tough, because I think you're right. It's not like prosecutors are out to create an unjust system, but their job, and often their metrics in terms of how they're evaluated on their job, is to charge people with crimes and get convictions. And so there's a kind of misaligned incentives there if we want to reduce the size of the system. It's why it's really interesting to see liberal defense side folks running for prosecutorial positions across the country to kind of try to help people rethink this. But it involves a pretty drastic rethinking of the power dynamics in our system generally, I think. And then once we talk about sentencing fewer people for less time, we also have to think about the tough cases of how we treat even the people who we think maybe do deserve some punishment. And in that sense, Travis is really interesting also, right? Because if you've got a 16-year-old who committed 5 armed robberies, we're like, okay, we need some kind of social intervention, right? We don't, you and
right, we can't just let this go on.
Right, exactly. You and I don't think that this is like dismissible, but the social intervention we did have seems expensive and ineffective. And so how do we think differently even about those tough cases? And that's a place where I think we as a society just haven't done the hard work. A lot of the mass incarceration conversation starts where I started, saying, okay, fewer people, less time. But we also have to do the hard work to think about the tough cases.
Maybe let's shift our attention a little bit to the experience of solitary confinement.
Mm-hmm.
You've done a lot of research and writing on solitary confinement.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess maybe starting with what were your thoughts on Travis's experience of solitary
Mm-hmm.
confinement, and how does that fit into the broader conversation about the use of solitary confinement as, I guess, what the prisons would think of as the last resort
Mm-hmm.
for keeping inmates in line?
Mm-hmm. And sadly, this is another part of Travis's story where I thought, wow, this is an incredible, inspiring human being, and yet his experiences are not unusual, right? This is his experience of losing hope in prison, trying to escape, and being put indefinitely in solitary confinement is very representative of how people end up there, right? I often characterize people in solitary confinement as people who just don't fit in the system, or kind of threaten the legitimacy of the system. And of course, escape is one of the ways that happens, right? And those tend to be the people who spend the longest in solitary confinement. And one thing that's really important to understand about solitary is people often, especially when you hear about a place like Red Onion, which is infamous as one of the harshest prisons in the U.S. One of the first reports about modern supermax facilities was done about Red Onion by Human Rights Watch, and there have been a few documentaries about it. When you think of a place like that, we often imagine that who's going there are the worst criminals, right? That it's the people who did the worst things on the outside and judges are sentencing them there. But what's so important is the people who are going there are actually the people who break in-prison rules.
Right.
And on the one hand, Travis tried to escape. On the other, he did not get very far. And he's clearly very smart, very creative, very focused. He's like the furthest you could imagine getting trying to escape. And he didn't get there at all. And so on the one hand, obviously you don't try to escape from prison and he's dangerous. And on the other, I've always thought it's strange that people who tried to escape like him are the ones who spend the longest periods of time in solitary and are held up as the most dangerous in the prison system, because obviously people don't escape from medium and high security prisons in the U.S.
Right.
Because there is so much control. And in a way, it's sort of strange to me that someone like that is considered such a threat to the system. But it is about the fact that it's like they punched a little hole in the armor, and the system is overreacting. And I think that's also representative of one of the problems with our criminal justice system writ large, is that we tend to overreact to things, whether it's an attempted escape or one person who does a horrible crime, and we build a whole national set of laws in reaction to that one crime rather than trying to address what went wrong in that one case.
Yeah, so I've been teaching classes at Augusta Correctional Center, where Travis was an inmate, for 3 years now. So I take 10 Washington and Lee students, and they take a class with 10 inmates, and the inmates and the Washington and Lee students are equal in the class. I do this for a month every spring. And one of the things that has completely shifted in my own mind is that this idea of prisoners as monsters. My own thinking, it's not that I really bought into that beforehand, but I would hear that. And it was, I think, in our culture and in our vernacular, this idea of violent prisoners as monsters. And working with inmates on a day-to-day basis. And mind you, in my class this past year, 7 of the 10 inmates in my class were in for murder. So it's a serious environment. It's a serious prison. And that has been completely called into question in my mind. And it's something I grapple with. I don't have an answer for it. This idea, and this is, I think, one of the central tensions of teaching a class like this, and something that the my Washington and Lee students grapple with, is this question of what does it mean to have done something that is horrific 20 years ago? And what does that mean about who you are today? And I don't have a good answer for it. I do know that the idea of prisoners as monsters has completely, been taken out of my mind. But what's left is this really difficult question that I cannot answer for myself, and that I go back and forth with, and have found only more questions.
Yeah. No, I got involved in prison work in a similar way. I started teaching in prison and college, and in some sense, I had a similar experience where I hadn't even realized how deep my stereotypes were about who I was going to be meeting, and how surprised I was by how much on a just basic human level we had in common. Certainly not much in terms of the opportunities we'd had in life. But, I just kept meeting prisoners who I enjoyed talking to and who I was never scared of, right? And that's something that's really stuck with me about the work I do, and that people often ask is, well, isn't it scary? No, it's not. It's not scary at all. And since, in the 20 years since I first walked into a prison to teach GED classes when I was a college student, I've interviewed hundreds of what our society considers the most serious criminals in the longest term solitary confinement and on death row. And I've never been scared. And that's not naivete, right? I think there are officers who have much more confrontational relationships with those populations who have a reason to be scared. But I go in wanting to hear people's stories, and am amazed every time at how, no matter what people have done, there's humanity there, and they're hungry for a conversation, and they have a story to tell. And I think, to the extent we imagine them as monsters and let one or two actions characterize the entirety of their existence, it's not just detrimental for one person. It has social consequences for us, because it allows us to treat people in prison as badly as we do when we other them to that degree. And so, I think one really important thing is just to have, right, like to go in and to have those moments, and to realize that we can't just dismiss these people as not human the way we have a tendency to do.
So I found a wide range from some inmates who I've actually written letters on their behalf to the parole board, who I think very clearly they've owned and accepted the responsibility of their crime. They feel very much changed. And I'm saying this not after talking to them for 30 minutes, but being with them for a full month.
Right.
So with enough knowledge that I feel comfortable writing letters. I've had many that I will not write letters for that that have asked me. I had one yesterday. I was at the prison yesterday giving a speech, and I had an inmate come up to me and ask if I would write him a letter. And I can't. I mean, I've spent a month with him, and I cannot imagine advocating on his behalf for his release. So I have found an incredible range. That doesn't mean at no point did I feel unsafe in the classroom with him. He was actually one of the best students. But there were several incidents and comments that he made that made me feel like society is probably not ready to have him outside.
Right. And this is the complexity of this work, right? I don't want my comments about not being scared and prisoners not being monsters. And I mean, none of them are monsters, right? To be misconstrued with saying we would be completely safe if all of them were our next door neighbors. One thing I will say in my work is that, interestingly, I think the system's assessment of who's dangerous is often very different from my assessment of who's dangerous.
Sure.
I think that's an important, that we're not very good. Both administrators and lay people this isn't necessarily a thing there's social expertise in, which is important to acknowledge. But no, I think that's really true. And it is a complicated piece of doing this work, is you really want your word to matter when someone like Travis comes up for pardon, and to be able to write a letter that makes a difference. And you can't do that for everybody, but so many of these people do deserve many more supports and interventions than they have.
So I was reading a statistic recently that 97% of cases go through plea bargains. Mm-hmm. And so we mentioned this earlier, right? The courts are just overpacked with cases. Mm-hmm. And for expediency and for cost purposes, we often have people plea out. Mm-hmm. And that's what Travis tried to do, right? Mm-hmm. Travis wanted to accept a plea bargain. Mm-hmm. And the consequence of, just from a judicial perspective, of 97% of cases pleading out is that we don't have a legal system, right? Mm-hmm. If people do not have representation, some plea bargains, of course, are going to happen, but 97% means that we don't have trials, we don't have defenses, we don't have prosecutions. We have people that get accused of something, and whether they're guilty or not, they take a plea.
Right.
And it seems so lopsided that you just throw some threat, right? The conversation might go along the following lines. All right, sir, if you have a trial, then you might face 30 years in prison, or you can take right now 5 years. Which are you going to take? Now, even if somebody's innocent, they might take those 5 years because exactly. the threat of the full sentence is so high that it might just be in your best interest to plea out. Whereas what we really want is we want two sides where somebody can actually put out a vigorous defense, like our criminal justice system was intended.
Exactly. Although there are so many challenges with the way the system operates, but I'll focus on two. One is this is a scale problem, right? This goes back to we arrest too many people and we put too many people in prison for too long, and so part of the issue is we have to rethink the scale. And then the system would hopefully be slightly less overwhelmed. But there's also a power dynamics problem in the structure of the system, and this goes back to determinate sentencing, and that's that the prosecutor has the power to say to the defendant, I'm going to charge you, right? That when you say that if you go to trial, you might get 30 years, that's because the prosecutor is saying, well, I'll charge you with a minor crime if you take this plea deal, and that's harder to prove, but also harder to defend against. And if we go to trial, I'll charge you with a more serious crime. And the fact is, there's all kinds of complicated procedural rules in our system, and the cost of lawyering and the likelihood that defendants in these situations won't be able to put enough investment into having a good lawyer means that when you go to trial, your odds of winning are very low. But the idea that the prosecutors have so much power in this process is really important, and that's a place where some procedural interventions could potentially change that. So that's part of the issue with plea bargaining too.
I've gained a better appreciation for prosecutors through Preet Bharara's podcast.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I've been reading his book actually. Yeah,
yeah, he's given me I think before his podcast, I had a more negative view about prosecutors, and he's definitely increased my appreciation for their judgment and their own process.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the New York bar's office is a special office.
Yeah, the Southern District of New York. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a couple friends who work there, but I think that a lot of prosecutors are trying to do the right thing. And I generally, in our criminal justice system, I think another group who gets a really bad reputation among liberals, especially, is correctional officers. And I think prosecutors and correctional officers are both people who, not to lump them together, but who tend to go into the work because they want to do good social service work and make society a more just place. And that's important to remember, and not, I think we get very black and white about it, and that we're not going to get anywhere with that kind of perspective.
I want to turn our attention a little bit to the rehabilitation question. Mm-hmm. So what are the best practices that are going on right now in terms of an inmate is sentenced, they're serving it out. What are some of the best things that are out there, and then what are some of your concerns?
I will talk about two good practices, and then I'll talk about concerns. So one good practice is education, as you and I are both familiar with. And this is, there's lots of debates in criminal justice literature about what works and what doesn't. But the data on education is pretty impressive, that the more education prisoners complete, the better they are on every metric, from behaving in prison to not committing new crimes when they're released, to getting jobs and paying taxes and having good lives, right?
Yeah, I mean, we get 150 to 200 applications for 10 spots for the inmates,
right,
for my class,
and that is to say that we don't, right? There's infinitely more interest, and not everyone in prison wants to get an education, and so we can have a conversation about that. But right now we have a massive unmet need across the United States in terms of prisoners interested in getting an education and lack of opportunities to do that, and it's something that we know will make a difference and literally make us all safer and cost us less money. So that's one that's a no-brainer to me. And there's now Obama started, and Trump is continuing to allow prisoners to have access to at least some Pell Grants, meaning that they have federal funds in order to enroll in college courses. That's not a panacea, but it is a step, and an important symbolic step also in the right direction, to saying, this is a population that needs education, and we know education works. So that's one no-brainer to me. The second, and I think this is really interesting. I mentioned I've done work in Scandinavia, and one of the central tenets of punishment in Scandinavia, or incarceration in Scandinavia, is that life in prison should be as normal as possible, or as much like life outside of prison as possible. And this normalization principle seems to have really great effects also. So that means, everything from prisoners might wear their own clothes, to the fact that prisoners take care of themselves. They cook their own meals. They do their own laundry. They're able to maintain better connections with their families. Often there's playgrounds and places that are less institutional and more comfortable for families to come visit. And those kinds of things. And there's a few, they tend to be smaller, but there's a few American prison systems. North Dakota is one that are really trying to implement these principles in some of their prisons. And even some of the people looking at reforming solitary confinement have done it with this in mind, that even in the most restrictive conditions, what can be done to normalize things. And I think that there's some power to that, in part because it admits that people, 99% of people are going to come home and be our neighbors. And so we want to equip them to do that.
Yeah, it strikes me that from both a selfish and a justice perspective,
yes.
You want to empower inmates to change.
Yes.
If all you do is care about yourself and public safety, then you want them to be rehabilitated.
Yes.
If you care about the inmates from a justice perspective, you want them to be rehabilitated.
Exactly. And I'll say something that doesn't get said often enough. If you care about correctional officers and their well-being, you want prison conditions to be better, because correctional officers are also living in those conditions, and the consequences for them are terrible. They have really high suicide rates, really low and destructive mental health outcomes. And it's one of the things that's striking about Scandinavia is that their correctional officers are happier, experience less violence, live longer, right? So these are important aspects also. The caveat I would say is just that, I might sound like a broken record, but our system is too big and too expensive. And in as much as these kinds of rehabilitation-oriented programs involve investing more in the system, I'm hesitant, right? To the extent we can do as much as possible outside of the system, getting people out of prison and enrolled in college, instead of making massive investments in building colleges in prison, right? That's better. So that's the caveat.
And some of your concerns on the rehabilitation side?
That was that one that, I worry that rehabilitation often means giving even more resources to a really expensive, inefficient system. And so to the extent those resources can be focused on providing services outside of the system, I think that's really important. And generally, I think historically, philosophically, concerns with rehabilitation and with things like normalization involve, worrying that people are being forced into a certain kind of social norm, and especially in a system like the U.S. that's known for having a really disparate impact on Latinas and African Americans. It I think there's a real risk that any kind of rehabilitation program is forcing people into a particular kind of social norm that maybe we want a more diverse society than that, and people shouldn't be forced into those norms. But
so one of the things that has been an enduring effect of the class that I teach at the prison is the impact on the Washington and Lee students. Mm-hmm. And several of them have commented over the past few years, and I know it's indicative of them more broadly, is that before coming in, if they were looking to hire somebody and they had a criminal record, that they would not do so. Mm-hmm. And that after this class, that they realize that alone is not a reason not to hire somebody. Mm-hmm. And it's one of the most powerful things about this class is to see that shift in the way that they think of somebody who would otherwise just be the other, who is often not from my students' background, right. To see that shift in the way that they would, in a professional and in a personal settings, change the way that they view people with that have felonies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's one of the reasons I've been a lifelong advocate of education in prison, is not just that I think it makes sense for prisoners and it's good for society, but because I think the people who participate from the outside in those programs, whether teachers like you and me or students we bring in, really come to see people in prison differently. And, I think one of the other big pieces of how we think about change around criminal justice policies and mass incarceration is the fact that people who've been incarcerated face an incredible stigma, and any kind of reform is going to have to involve addressing that stigma head on. And I think one way to do that is just to introduce people to prisoners and former prisoners and show them that they're not as easy to pick out as they might think. Right? Yeah. They're still human beings who we can find things in common with. And I think that's a very slow process, but I think that's really critical to reintegration.
What were your thoughts on the First Step Act? This was the law that was signed. It was actually bipartisan. Amazingly got through Mitch McConnell and signed into law by Donald Trump in 2018. What were your thoughts on that? Or first, describe what the major features were, and then your thoughts.
So the First Step Act is designed to do some of what I've been advocating, right? To try to reduce the size and scale of our prison population through all kinds of mechanisms, like giving people opportunities to shorten their sentences, shortening sentences going forward, trying to keep people out of prison through alternatives to incarceration. So I'd say it has a symbolic power that's very important, that there was bipartisan support and that there's a widespread social consensus, I think, that mass incarceration or our criminal justice system as it's operating today isn't doing what we want. And we as a society, even though we disagree about lots of things, think that there's room for reform and we can change it. And so from that perspective, First Step, right? Even the name is really important for acknowledging that there's a lot of work to do and that we as a society want to take steps in that direction. In the nitty gritty, I find it a very disturbing bill, and it's why I have to focus on the symbolism and the name, because I think the power of privatization in our criminal justice system is destructive. And people often think of private prisons, but for prisoners, and this is a different story for immigrants, but for prisoners in the U.S., fewer than 10% of prisons are run by private corporations. Right. But all of the services in prison are privatized. So the communications prisoners have, like whether they have access to a phone and...
Oh, I know. I pay for JPay.
Exactly.
Just like the amount of money you have to spend just to send an email.
Exactly. Healthcare, food services, all of that is privatized. All of those private corporations have a real financial interest in the scale of the system being maintained the way it is, because this is massively profitable. The profit margins on these companies are astronomical, unlike anything else you see in any other industry. So one of the more disturbing aspects of the First Step Act is that many of these service providing corporations were advocating for it because alternatives to incarceration is area where there's lots of room for privatized service provision investment, like the kinds of monitors people wear if they're on constant GPS monitoring,
Gotcha.
or private companies running halfway houses that are open facilities without fences, secure fences, the way a prison would be. And so that, I think they played a big role in the First Step Act. And it's great if we're getting people out of prison and the restrictive, harsh conditions of confinement we have in our prisons. But often people talk about this in terms of net widening. If we're just putting more people on GPS monitors that they have to pay for, that private corporations are profiting off of, we're not necessarily reducing the system. And we're certainly not, I often think about this in terms of kind of fundamental change or Band-Aid change. And I worry that the First Step Act is Band-Aid change that's also deepening corporate investment in our criminal justice system.
As somebody who's not enmeshed in the world of criminology, I was amazed when that passed that there was anything that could get bipartisan support on criminology, on criminal justice, given that nothing receives bipartisan support aside from naming a postmaster general.
Right.
So
no,
I thought it was a great sign to at least at a minimum see that in this one area that is the most glaring. I mean, truly, the ridiculousness of the United States criminal justice system is so glaring that it was nice to see, even in the current political climate, that there could be some bipartisan support to limit mandatory minimums. They changed some of the elderly release policies, and that was a good sign to see.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think the consensus around any social acknowledgement that what we're doing doesn't make sense in terms of criminal justice is heartening to see. And so I don't want to be that person who where the perfect is the enemy of the good. But I worry, and I worry that people aren't thinking, as someone who thinks historically about criminal justice, I think we tend to go back and forth between periods where there's this kind of consensus and we want to invest in rehabilitation and we want to try to make the system more humane and more effective. And then these periods where we're really harsh. And I think breaking that cycle will require thinking more creatively and more outside the box.
All right. Well, on that note, I think we'll probably best to call it a day.
Okay.
I appreciate your joining me on the podcast and contributing your time and providing me and the listeners with an education.
Thanks so much for covering this topic and for sharing Travis's story. I hope someday I'll get to meet him. He inspired me also.
Yeah, I mean, Travis on my end has been, one of the most amazing people that I've gotten to know in my life. I mean, my overlap with his story, and then I've played a kind of a mentor but also friend role for him over the past year and a half since he got out. We talk probably about once a month. I'm usually bugging him about something. So yeah, it's been a really amazing experience for me.
And I'll say, even though I think he's incredibly charismatic and inspiring and unique, I think everyone who has the opportunity to teach in prison meets a handful of Travises who really reshape the way we think about the system and human possibility. And they're not, there's lots of folks like him in prison in that sense who are just incredibly resilient and who stick in my mind and I think of when I'm having a bad day.
Right. I mean, I'll tell you one of the things that's crazy is that before I taught this class, if you had told me that I would get involved with a pardon case, that someone who had committed 5 armed robberies would get pardoned, and then would be staying at my house, right? I would have thought that was crazy. Right. And before I learned about this population, if you told me I would have a convicted armed robber staying at my house, I've got a 2 and a 3-year-old. I would have thought you were nuts. And then lo and behold, that's how much I've changed.
Right. And this is, I mean, when I talk about these issues, people often say, what can we do? And I often say, really paying attention and getting to know these people is in some ways, I think, the most important thing we can do.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much.
Take care. I enjoyed talking with you.
Thanks for listening to the podcast today. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me at jeffshatten1@gmail.com. You can tweet me at jeffshatten. If you like this podcast, press the subscribe button and make sure to rate it on iTunes so that other people can find it.